What if the peace deal everyone is celebrating was never meant to bring peace? What if the real strategy was hiding in plain sight, and Washington walked right into it? On June 30th, 2026, Donald Trump posted on Truth Social that a peace agreement with Iran would be signed the very next day. He said the Strait of Hormuz would immediately reopen. He said Iran would never get a nuclear weapon. Every major network ran with it. CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera. The headlines were almost identical. Is this the deal? Is the war finally ending? Before we go any further, if you want analysis that goes deeper than the headlines, that actually explains the strategy behind the story, subscribe right now. Hit the like button so this reaches people who need to see it. And share it with one person today who thinks they already understand what's happening in the Middle East. Because I promise you, by the end of this, both of you will see it differently. Now let's get into it. Here's the question nobody in mainstream media is asking. While American and Iranian diplomats are shaking hands and talking about peace, what is Israel doing? The answer is straightforward, and it shatters the entire narrative. Israel is bombing southern Lebanon right now. As these negotiations are happening, the city of Nabatea, more than 20 villages. On June 12th and 13th, Israel issued mass evacuation orders across southern Lebanon and carried out heavy airstrikes targeting Hezbollah infrastructure. Hezbollah responded with rockets and drones into northern Israel. People died on both sides. This is not background noise. This is the central contradiction that makes everything else collapse. Think about what this actually means. Iranian Foreign Minister Araghchi went on state television on June 12th and stated clearly that any agreement must include a permanent ceasefire in Lebanon and a full Israeli withdrawal from Lebanese territory. He said Iran has never forgotten Lebanon and will not abandon those who stood with it. At the exact same moment, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu told Trump directly, and then confirmed it publicly through his defense minister, that Israel is not a party to any agreement between Washington and Tehran. Israel will retain complete freedom of military action in all arenas, including Lebanon, to protect its citizens. Two positions, completely incompatible. And America is standing in the middle trying to hold both at once. Trump is apparently asking Netanyahu to hold back on Lebanon strikes to give the negotiations room to breathe. Netanyahu is ignoring him, literally ignoring the sitting president of the United States and continuing to bomb. Think carefully about what that tells you about how much leverage America actually has over its closest ally in the region. Now here's the layer beneath that. Netanyahu's refusal to be bound by any Iran deal isn't just about short-term Israeli security. It fits a much longer strategic vision. A stable Iran is a powerful Iran. A weakened Iran still fighting proxy conflicts, still dealing with internal pressure, still hemorrhaging resources through Hezbollah. That's a more manageable Iran from Israel's perspective. Permanent regional stability isn't necessarily in Israel's strategic interest right now. Controlled instability is. So Israel keeps bombing. Iran keeps insisting Lebanon is part of any deal. America keeps announcing that peace is hours away. And the cycle continues. This is the first reason there is no sustainable agreement here. Not Iranian stubbornness. Not American impatience. Israel is the variable that no negotiating table can contain, because Israel was never at the table. Now let's assume, just for a moment, that Netanyahu picks up the phone tomorrow and agrees to pause operations in Lebanon. Let's say that obstacle somehow disappears. Would the deal work then? Still no. And to understand why, you need to understand what Iran is actually doing at the negotiating table. Because the Iranians themselves have told us, clearly and openly, what this process is really about. The Iranian newspaper Khorasan, not a Western outlet, not an American think tank, but an Iranian publication, wrote that the main function of this agreement is to provide breathing space and a chance to rebuild offensive and defensive military capacity in preparation for a larger confrontation ahead. Kayhan, the hardline Iranian daily that reflects the supreme leader's ideological worldline as closely as any publication in the country, ran a front page that said, "We closed the strait with power. We will not open it with diplomacy." And before his death, the former Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei reportedly told his own inner circle that negotiations with America were, in his words, just a delay until the Islamic Shiite state is fully established. These quotes weren't written for Western audiences. They weren't diplomatic spin. They were internal. Communications and domestic publications reflecting what Iran's strategic leadership actually believes. Some analysts will say those are just the hardliners talking, that the diplomatic faction around Araghchi genuinely wants a resolution. And that's fair. There's a real split inside Iran between the negotiators who want economic relief and the IRGC leadership that views any compromise as strategic surrender. But here's what that argument misses. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is not just a military force, it is an economic empire, construction monopolies, logistics networks, import controls, shadow financial systems that operate completely outside the official Iranian state budget. When Iran's economy collapses under sanctions and blockade, Ordinary Iranians suffer enormously. IRGC generals do not suffer in the same way. Their institutional survival does not depend on economic recovery, and the IRGC has already shown you what they think of this deal. They leaked the contents of the memorandum, of understanding to their own affiliated media, specifically the Mehr news agency, specifically to publicly commit Iran to maximalist positions that the diplomatic team never intended to make public. IRGC-aligned protesters showed up outside the foreign ministry in Mashhad calling Araghchi a traitor. Iran's judiciary chief, the man who controls who gets arrested in the country, publicly declared that Iran's confrontation with America will have no end except with the complete uprooting of oppression and arrogance. When the person with the power to imprison the peace negotiator says there will be no peace, a document signed in Islamabad doesn't change the strategic reality. Always trust actions over words, and Iran's actions are speaking very loudly right now. While diplomats were negotiating in Oman, Iranian military engineers were collapsing tunnels and placing explosive mines around the entrances to nuclear facilities in Isfahan. CNN confirmed this based on 5 separate U.S. intelligence sources. Approximately 440 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60%, enough for roughly 11 nuclear weapons, is now buried under collapsed rock and surrounded by landmines. You don't bury your nuclear material under landmines if you're planning to hand it over. That's what a tactical pause looks like. Not peace, a strategic breath, economic oxygen. Time to rebuild, reposition, and prepare for what comes next. And speaking of what comes next, we need to talk about the Strait of Hormuz, because this is the part of the story that almost no one in mainstream media is discussing, and it is, without question, the most consequential piece of this entire situation. You've been watching this long enough that you understand this isn't simple. Drop a comment right now with just one word, the first word that comes to mind when you hear Strait of Hormuz. I read every single one. And after you comment, share this video with someone who would never normally watch geopolitical analysis. Sometimes the most important conversations start with people who don't think they're interested. Now let's talk about Hormuz. The strait is 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. 20% of the world's entire oil supply moves through it. Japan imports 75% of its oil through that channel, China 40%, India 60%. The Japanese Prime Minister has publicly stated that if the strait closes, Japan's economy collapses within 8 to 9 months. This waterway is not just a geographic feature. It is the physical foundation of the petrodollar system, the financial architecture that has sustained American global power since the 1970s. Here's how it works. Gulf states sell oil. They receive a payment in US dollars. Those dollars flow back into American treasury bonds and financial markets. That circular system is what allows the United States to carry nearly $40 trillion in national debt and still function as the world's reserve currency. The Strait of Hormuz is the choke point that makes all of it possible, and Iran is claiming permanent control over it. Foreign Minister Araghchi said publicly that Iran's sword will always hang over the strait. The Iranian draft agreement contains no commitment to relinquish management rights. An Iranian lawmaker publicly compared Iran's proposed Hormuz management bill to the oil nationalization of 1951, when Iran kicked out British petroleum interests and claimed sovereign control over its own resources. That comparison is not casual, it is deliberate signaling. And now the Iranian parliament is actively drafting legislation that would formally codify Iran's right to collect fees from ships passing through the strait, not as a negotiating position. As domestic law, think about what that means. Even if a memorandum of understanding gets signed this weekend, even if Trump holds a ceremony and declares victory, the Iranian parliament could pass that bill the following week. And a statute embedded in Iranian domestic law is not something a diplomatic document can erase. The pre-war status of Hormuz, open, free, guaranteed by American naval power, is gone. The question is no longer whether Iran will claim management rights. The question is how long it will take the world to accept that reality and what it means for everything built on top of it. Because here's the scenario that nobody wants to say out loud. Iran doesn't need to close the strait to break the system. It just needs to make the strait permanently uncertain, not closed. Just unpredictable. Ships approaching and not knowing whether they'll be targeted. Insurance rates for tankers spiking to unsustainable levels, shipping companies rerouting, Gulf oil becoming unreliable as a supply source, investment drying up, the petrodollar circular flow slowly corroding from underneath. And Iran has the tools to sustain that uncertainty indefinitely. Approximately 80,000 drones stockpiled, production running at roughly 500 new units per day. Each drone costs around $50,000 to build. Each American interception attempt costs between $1 and $3 million. And the interceptions don't always succeed, meaning sometimes you fire 2 or 3 missiles at a single drone. For every $50,000 Iran spends, America spends up to $3 million to respond. That asymmetry, sustained over months and years, is not a war America can win on economics alone. Now let me give you the strongest argument for the other side, because this analysis only holds up if it can withstand honest challenge. The case for a real agreement is this: both sides are exhausted in ways that matter. The Iranian economy is being strangled. Ordinary Iranians are suffering under a combination of war, naval blockade, and decades of accumulated sanctions. Trump needs a political achievement he can point to, something Obama and Biden never delivered. The global economy is bleeding because of Hormuz disruption. European manufacturers, Japanese corporations, Chinese supply chains, all of them are absorbing damage every day this continues. These are enormous pressures pushing both governments towards some kind of resolution. And smart analysts argue that once both sides formally declare an end to hostilities, the political cost of returning to war increases significantly. Signing something, even something ambiguous, creates a ratchet effect. It becomes harder to climb back to active conflict after you've publicly committed to peace. That has real value. That argument is not wrong. It deserves respect. But here is what it cannot account for. The people inside Iran who have the most power to resume this conflict, the IRGC, do not need the Iranian economy to recover. Their parallel financial empire insulates them from the suffering that creates pressure for peace. And they have already demonstrated, through the deliberate leaking of negotiating documents and the protests they organized outside the foreign ministry, that they are actively working to sabotage the diplomatic track. When the hardest power inside a government is working against the peace deal its own diplomats are negotiating, the peace deal cannot hold. 6 specific deadlocks make this concrete. The Strait of Hormuz: Trump demands immediate free passage for all ships. Iran demands permanent management rights and service fees, mutually exclusive. The uranium stockpile: Washington demands Iran's enriched uranium be dismantled and removed from the country. Iran says it will only dilute uranium inside Iran. And while that argument was happening on paper, Iran was burying the uranium under landmines. The sequencing problem: Iran demands the naval blockade be lifted and frozen assets released before technical nuclear talks begin. America says nothing changes hands until Iran proves compliance. Both positions are rational. Neither can move first. War reparations: Iran's draft included compensation for damage caused by American and Israeli strikes. Trump listed rejection of reparations as a non-negotiable precondition for returning to the table. That is a dead end the moment it's raised. The axis of resistance: America demands Iran stop funding Hezbollah and Hamas. Iran says it will never abandon Hezbollah. And Israel is bombing Hezbollah right now, making the theoretical argument about future Iranian support almost irrelevant to what's happening on the ground. And finally, the internal fragmentation: Iran's diplomatic team is trying to negotiate while IRGC-aligned factions actively sabotage them domestically. In Washington, Democratic senators are calling the deal a surrender document. Republican senators like Lindsey Graham and Roger Wicker are calling for escalation rather than negotiation. Neither government is unified behind the deal it's supposedly trying to sign. 6 deadlocks, 0 of them resolved, and a signing ceremony reportedly scheduled for Sunday. Here are 3 things to watch in the days ahead. First, if the memorandum gets signed, watch how each side describes it in the following 24 hours. America will say Hormuz is open and Iran surrendered its nuclear material. Iran will say it retained management rights over the strait and secured asset releases. When you hear those 2 completely incompatible descriptions of the same document, you're looking at confirmation that both governments are selling different versions of an ambiguous agreement to their own domestic audiences. That's not a peace deal. That's a shared fiction with an expiration date. Second, watch Israel in the 48 hours after any signing. If Israel continues strikes in Lebanon, and Hezbollah continues responding, and Iran says nothing about withdrawing support for Hezbollah, then the core condition Iran publicly demanded has already been violated by a party that agreed to nothing. The deal will have been broken before the ink dries. Third, watch the Iranian parliament and the Hormuz management bill. If that legislation advances after a peace deal is signed, it means Iran is converting a negotiating position into domestic law. And domestic law outlasts any memorandum of understanding. Here's where this all lands. Every channel right now is focused on whether Trump and Iran sign a document. That's the drama. That's what generates clicks and airtime. But the document is not the story. The 60 days after the document is the story. In those 60 days, the 6 deadlocks will resurface in the technical negotiations. Israel will continue operating independently of whatever was agreed. The IRGC will continue its parallel strategy. Iran's uranium will remain under collapsed tunnels and landmines. And the Iranian parliament will continue converting Hormuz management rights from a diplomatic stance into permanent domestic law. The petrodollar system that has underwritten American financial power since 1974 was built on a guarantee that American military strength ensures free and open access to the world's energy supply. That guarantee is being tested right now in a 33-kilometer channel between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula. And the test is not going well. This is not a story about whether Trump gets a trophy to hold up at a press conference. This is a story about whether the financial architecture of the American-led global order survives the next decade intact. Iran's three-stage strategy was never complicated once you see it clearly. First, bleed the opposition through proxy networks and straight disruption. Second, negotiate not to end the conflict, but to buy time, get economic oxygen, and let the hardliners fortify what matters most. Third, lock in permanent legal and strategic control over Hormuz. While the world is distracted by signing ceremonies, Washington got the ceremony, Iran got the strait. The real question now is not whether a memorandum of understanding was signed on Sunday. The real question is which side used this pause more effectively to prepare for what comes next. And if Iran's uranium is under landmines, its drone production is running at 500 units per day, and its parliament is codifying Hormuz control into domestic law, that question may already have an answer.